Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, it's Zoe. I'm your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership expert. And my question for you today is this. Have you ever been in a conversation where you thought or said, I'm right, you're wrong, and nothing the other person would do or say could budge you? Well, chances are that this either-or thinking is causing a lot of suffering. Would you like some relief from that? Well, my guest today will help us do just that. We go from either-or thinking to the power of and. So I've got some great new updates for you. The book is coming along extremely well. So we are working to the deadline of December out into the world. So that's my novel that I've been working on all year. It's very exciting that we're getting there. Amplifiers is progressing at full tilt. We've got a growing cohort both in Canberra and around Australia. And if you're interested, just go to zoerouth.com and click on Amplifiers. But I want to introduce our guest today. I just love this conversation. His name is Brian Emerson, and he is the principal and founder of And Iron. He is a coach and consultant with a PhD in organizational systems. He is an author. He is a co-author of 2 books, in fact. One is A Manager's Guide to Coaching, and his second book, Navigating Polarities, Using Both and Thinking to Lead Transformation. This second book, the Navigating Polarities one, is what we used earlier this year in the Amplifiers group as part of their quarterly book. And so we did a whole expose and exploration of how to use polarities as a sense-making tool in difficult situations. And in this fantastic interview, we get into a deeper dive around that. What are some practical examples, some challenges we see in the workplace, and how we can use the sense-making tool of polarities to resolve some of that, and at the same time, become more expanded in our leadership abilities and expanded in our identity as leaders, which makes us more versatile, more flexible, more responsive, and ultimately more effective. That's the promise of today's interview. I absolutely loved it. Let's get into it. Brian Emerson, all the way from just north of Washington, D.C., welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
I've been really looking forward to this interview because I found your book. So I've been teaching polarities as part of my leadership development program, Amplifiers. And learning how to think in complexity has been really important part of that. And thinking through the polarity lens is one of the ways to help people extend their leadership thinking. And so to have one of the co-authors of Navigating Polarities, which is a beautiful extension of the original work on polarities, I think is so exciting. So there we go. That's my little fangirl rant. So welcome again.
No, it's great to be here. I mean, I like that you're able to use the book and that it's useful.
Oh, absolutely it is. And whenever I talk to somebody as advanced in their leadership thinking as you, I love to know, how did you get to this place? How did you get to this place where you can consider and write about such complex issues like polarities? What's your origin story?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. How I got here, I think, I've always been fascinated by, always, even as a young child, by leadership groups doing things differently, all in the sake of doing things better, and by better, I define better probably by saying with more heart, right? And really, it really drove me. I think that I spent time, well, growing up, I always wanted to work for the Olympics. Like that was my goal.
Really?
Right? Because that was I think it's because I knew that I couldn't be in the Olympics. And so, but there was something about the world coming together and seeing what was possible, like in a young person's mind, seeing what was possible when people with their differences and everything came together, what could be created. It was something that I just wanted to be a part of.
Really? So just pause for a second.
Yeah.
Just Olympics. Were you a particular athlete in high school? Like, was that sort of the entree, or was it just the whole idea of the world coming together?
It's the world coming together. It's really more of the world coming together and people being at their best, and like the stories of the athletes. And, at least here in the States, the way that the Olympics is broadcast is that there's as much story as there is sport, around, the athletes, and just fascinated by what people could overcome and what they could achieve and what made that possible. And so I spent time working for the Olympics for a while, worked for some trials here in the States that picked the 92 gymnastics team, and then had a break. And during that break, I went and I worked in Africa for a number of years. And
okay, so this is the story I want to tease out, because we hopped on the show, and right behind you is this, and of course the listeners can't see this, but it's a beautiful poster of the movie The Power of One, which I loved that book. I thought it was an amazing book. So I'm like, oh, what's that all about? So tell me about the book, and then all of a sudden you're in Africa.
Yeah. So, I will say that the book is almost completely different than the movie, and they're both beautiful in their own ways. But when I was in graduate school at the time, and a friend called and said, "We're going to go see this movie. Do you want to go?" And I had never heard of it, and I said no. But then about a half an hour before the movie was supposed to start, I got this sense of, oh, well, you should go see the movie. And I went and saw the movie, and I started to cry about halfway through the movie, and I wept for the next 2 weeks. And really one of the points of the movie is that when people aren't educated and they're oppressed, one of the only things that they can do to rise, or to push back against the oppression is to become violent. Right. And so how education is such a key. And it was at that point that I thought, oh, I want to work with schools, and I want to do it in Africa. And I went to Namibia when they gained their independence from South Africa, and they were changing schools from Afrikaans to English. They were converting all the schools. I did organizational change work there. And that's where I really fell in love, getting back to your question of leadership. I got so jazzed by how do you get people who don't trust one another, who sometimes don't like each other, to actually come around a table and do something good, and do something good inside of an organization. And I decided that that's what I wanted to do when I got back. And of course, leadership falls out of that. And yeah, so a very long-winded answer to your, how did I get here and why am I passionate about this leadership stuff? And then polarities is such a key piece to that leadership puzzle, and getting people to, when I found out about polarities through Barry Johnson, who you mentioned at the beginning, I studied with Barry, worked with Barry, and actually decided to go back and do my PhD research on paradox and polarities. And it was during that time that I realized how much suffering happens when people don't know how to make sense of polarities, and got really passionate about how could I in some way be a part of helping people hold more of a both-and mindset to reduce suffering.
Oh, that's beautiful. So let's tease out a few terms, for not everybody's done a PhD in paradox and polarities. So could you define those two terms? Like, what is paradox and what is polarities?
Oh my gosh. And I could geek out on that forever. So a polarity, I'll start with polarities. Polarities are situations in which two seemingly opposite states have to coexist over time if we're going to be successful. And seemingly opposite is, I use that term because they're not necessarily opposites, even though our mind wants to make them opposites. So for example, structure and flexibility are not actually opposites, though they seem like they're opposites, right? And we need both of those things over time if we're going to be successful. So that's how that we define polarities. And then the term paradox, quite honestly, there's no one really good definition of it. And so what I find is that in the academic world, many people talk about paradox and they use almost the same definition that I just gave you for the word polarity. And in the practitioner world and in the business world, people use polarity more often. In our minds, though, a paradox is something where there are two seemingly opposite things, but we might not necessarily need both of them over time for success. So something like love and hate are paradoxical, but I'm not really sure we need hate over time to be successful, and so there are things where they're seemingly opposite, but I'm not really sure they fall under the same rule of polarities where we need both.
So with that example of love-hate, is that more of a spectrum or is it really poles?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know. I mean, I think is it a spectrum that sort of wraps around on itself, and are they two sides of the same coin? Meaning, because if one ceased to exist, would the other exist? And that really comes out of the whole philosophy of like yin and yang, right? Is that if there was no darkness, would there be light? So are they a spectrum, or are they two sides of the same coin, or what are they? I mean, I think it's a big mind twist.
Yeah, that's it. My brain just went into that.
Yeah, it's one of those big questions that it's like, oh, that's a fun thing to sit around a campfire and like, sort of geek out on and talk about.
Well, because it brings up the work around shadow as well,
yes.
Like from a philosophical point of view. And your statement of, do we need love and hate may be paradoxical, but do we need hate over time? Maybe not. Maybe we can sit and lead in love, knowing that the shadow of hate is always with us, but not always living from it or with it.
Yes. I love that. That's a great way of saying it. I love that.
Okay. Tick. Tick. Philosophical win on the podcast.
Exactly. I love it.
So in the work, you talk about the third way. And I think this is the lovely practical application of this whole idea of polarities, things that look like opposites but are interdependent, and we need them both over time, like structure and flexibility. And your book teases out, okay, well, if that's true, how do we do both? Because the suffering comes from not resolving them. So could you answer this question in two parts, please?
We'll see.
One is, let's talk a little bit about the suffering piece, and then move to talk about the third way, as I'm thinking is the resolution to part of that. So how does polarities drive suffering in your mind? What's your experience of that?
Yeah. So what I found in my research was that when people experience a polarity and they don't have a way to make sense of it, and so the way I talk about that is like when the polarity has them and they don't have it, and so when they're had by the polarity and they don't have a way to make sense of it, that typically they go through, and teams and groups go through some predictable stages. The first of which is they have a preference. So when push comes to shove, structure, flexibility, I know both are important, but I like flexibility a little bit better, right? When it comes to candor, diplomacy, I know both are really important, but I'm wired really more to be diplomatic than candid. And so I'm not really sure where those preferences come from. And we could have a whole nother philosophical, conversation about that. But what starts to happen is people can, if they hold on to an either or mindset, that's structure or flexibility, candor or diplomacy, what happens is they can begin to attach themselves to that and begin to attach part of their identity to it. So it's things like, I've worked with people and have myself said things like, I'm the structure guy. I'm the one who keeps the trains on schedule, right? And I've worked with people who said, oh no, but I'm about flexibility. I'm the one who can go with the flow. And we begin to create who we are around these polarities. And then what happens is that from a psychological perspective, we understand ourselves as human beings in part by what we're not, right? And so it's called disidentification theory, right? Which is where part of how I understand myself as an American is because I'm not Australian, right? There is an other, right? And so part of how I identify...
That's more Canadian. That's more Canadian American.
I love it. That's great. But I identify as male. So part of how I identify or understand myself as a man is because I'm not a woman, right? I have an other to help me make sense of who I am. And with an either or mindset, then I can begin to make the other wrong. Right. And so I keep the trains on the track. I'm the structure person, right? You're the one who likes it flexible. You're the one who's always trying to mess things up. I make myself good, I make you bad, and then we get at loggerheads, right? And this is where teams, and you look at the current political system in the world, right? My country, right at the very front of where the energy is stuck in the political system because we are othering and we're either oring, and you can look at that in the States or, Brexit, everywhere, right? In terms of how we're suffering because people see it as an either or proposition as opposed to thinking more from a both and perspective.
So I've been having really pragmatic conversations with leaders that are this, so one that I had, was it yesterday? Might have been the day before yesterday, with a leader who for 15 months has had his team working from home. And now it's like, okay, everyone back to the office. And a lot of people are like, nah, I don't want to come back to the office. And they're sort of sitting at loggerheads where the leader is saying, I want everybody back in the office because you guys are not being accountable. You've been bludging. You've been getting away with this. I want you all here so I can see what you're doing and build relationships. So he's listing the long laundry list of why it's important everybody's back in the office. And his colleagues are saying, well, I have to give up X, Y, and Z, and this is why it's bad. And they look like it's intractable. And the hybrid model is what's being spruiked around the traps. But I'm not sure that just saying, well, here's your solution, a hybrid model, because that's what the employees are suggesting is going to work in this case. How would you help the leader look at it through or would you help the leader with a polarity lens around this?
Yeah, so I think it's a great example, this, going back to the office, because not everything's a polarity, obviously, right? And not all polarities are worth our time, really worrying about, because we can navigate them pretty well. Underneath of, as I think about it, underneath of go back to the office, problem that we have to solve or that many leaders have to solve right now really is focus on what's best for the employee and focus on what's best for the organization.
Yes.
Right. I
mean,
and I think that, and that's the tension, right? And so what's best for, many employees, right, is to be at home and to have the flexibility, but what's best for the organization is to make sure that there is good team connection, that there is good synergy, happening, in cross conversations, right? And so reframing the problem state. What I like about polarities is that when we ask a question, we get an answer, but the way that we ask the question completely impacts the answer that we get, right? And so when we ask a question from an either or mindset, we get an either or answer. But if we can figure out a way to ask a question from a both and mindset, then I think that's what we get, different answers, right? And so if I was teeing up a different problem solution, instead of saying, should we make people come back or not, right? It would be something about how do we create a work environment where employees have flexibility, and employees can, be at home when they want to be home without us impacting the overall culture dynamic of the organization, where we have, collaboration, happening across the hallway, or whatever the problem statement may be. And that becomes what we're trying to solve for, which is just a different way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. And so that leads us into the third way. So rather than this or that, it's and. Can you explain your version or your interpretation or use of the third way?
Yeah, so the third way really comes out of the work by Richard Rohr, who does a lot of writing. He is actually a spiritual leader, but writes a lot about paradox and polarities and dualism in his work. And he uses the term third way to refer to a state in which the benefits of both poles exist without excluding either of the poles, right? And so both of the poles exist. I oftentimes refer to it like a blending of colors, right? When we blend red and blue together, we get purple. Both red and blue exist in purple, especially to artists. They can see the red and the blue. And so when we talk about third way solutions, it's about how can we get the best of both without excluding either and really stand in that space.
Mm-hmm. So if going back to my example with the leader, and I think it touches on the suffering piece. So listening to him, he sounds like he's determined to have his way. Like that's it. It's his way or the highway. This, I think, will lead to suffering.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit to that, your experience of that kind of attitude?
You mean in terms of how to deal with the my way?
Yeah. So how do we help people move from this either or thinking to and thinking?
Yeah. So I think part of it is helping people understand that when you have a polarity, both poles, okay, both of them have benefits that we've sort of talked about, but they both have overuses. Okay. It's not a list of pros and cons, and that's a big differentiator. So it's not making a pros and cons list, because there are no cons to focusing on the employee, and there are no cons to focusing on the organization. There are only bad things that happen if we over focus on employees to the neglect of the organization, or vice versa. And so helping people understand that their position, and we call it a diagonal, that their diagonal, their perspective has an overuse, is a big aha for many people, right? And that it's not a bad thing. It's just that I can take it too far, right? It's strengths that are taken too far. And so I think, in this case with this leader, to really work about, is his preference more for focus on the organization, or is his preference more for control, right? Control and empowerment, right? Or direct and empower. That's a huge leadership, polarity. And if he's got a real preference for directing or controlling and on the organization, it would be, to start thinking about what are the overuses of that pole, right? And in what ways will your solution actually lead to those overuses? And is that worth the risk? And typically it's not, right? And with polarities and a both and mindset, we're also not asking that leader to give up his love of control, right? Or to give up the love of focus on the organization. We're asking simply to expand, right? To start to experiment and play with and power without losing your love of control, right? To begin to focus on the needs of the employee without losing the focus on the organization, right? And that's a different question, and leaders can so often wrap their minds around that. So,
as you're talking, I'm thinking about a personal frame around this. The rest versus exercise polarity.
Yep, it's huge.
And so I've just. In March, I hurt my back, which is the overuse of working out. Mm-hmm. So it's just working out, not doing enough rest and relaxation. So overuse piece. And moving into third way, it's like, okay, how do we get the blend right? And one of the vulnerabilities, which is part of the third way principles, is to explore, the vulnerabilities. It's like, what if I get it wrong? Like, what if I get the balance wrong and I do too much rest and I lose fitness? Or what if I fall into bad habits again and I neglect the rest piece? Like, how do I work it out? So can you speak a little bit to the vulnerability piece? Because I'm thinking about my leaders who, as you say, have a preference for one pole or the other and love it and may become aware of the overuse piece of it. And then there's still a resistance to moving into a third way. How do you help people overcome that?
Yeah, so I think that the vulnerability piece is so important, right? And this really comes a lot out of the work. Brene Brown, who obviously is all the rage right now, talks about how that paradox, resolving paradox, is not possible without vulnerability, right? Like without that uncomfortableness. And part of that is because of what we were talking about with the identity piece. So I'll go back to my structure and flexibility example. If I'm the structure guy, and all of a sudden I'm so structured that I make things confined and rigid, and I get feedback from my boss that comes in and says, you know what, Brian, you're too tight and you need to loosen up and be more flexible. You need to be, and so we tell people to move from to something. Well, with an either or mindset, I hear, oh, so she actually just wants me to stop being structured, right? But wait a second, that's who I am. I'm the structure guy. I've been rewarded my whole entire life on being structured, and now you don't want me to be that. And what we know is that threat to that identity is just like being physically threatened, right? And we react the same way. And so the whole idea of me stepping into the third way to be more flexibly structured, if you will, if that's what we want to call that third way, might be, well, if I become more flexible, then I have to give up control. And that's scary, right? If that's, or if I become more flexible, we might miss the deadline. And if we miss the deadline, and that's scary, right? And until I can get in touch with that as a leader, and I'm never going to step into the third way. But I think most of the time in my work with leaders, as soon as people name the vulnerability, they realize, well, wait a second, that's sort of a funny little hypothesis that I have, right? That if I become more flexible, I'm going to miss the deadline. Well, who says that's true? Like that, and so really examining those vulnerabilities is key to being able to hold the third way.
I think this is really beautiful because the theme for the podcast this quarter is vertical development, which is essentially expanding your ability to see yourself, others, and the world in a more complex way. And the research that I've done certainly says the ability to hold two perspectives, which is polarity thinking, is one of the stepping stones to be able to do that. Can you tell me about your thoughts on vertical development and how you... well, let's start there.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on vertical development.
Yeah. So I'm right with you. I think vertical development is so important, right? In terms of how over time, the ways that we make sense of ourselves and the way that we make sense of the world so that we can take action in the world, how that develops and how that changes, and how part of vertical development is really being able to pull out how we're making sense and to examine it and question it and see if it needs to shift and alter. And I think polarities are a beautiful way to help that. I think polarities help in two different ways. I think that one piece of vertical development for all of us, if you look at research, as I'm sure you've come across, is that just the ability to supplement our either or thinking, because either or thinking is very important, right? But to be able to supplement that with both and thinking of the polarity world, how that is a vertical development move, right? That happens as we mature, over time. So I think polarities is important for that. But what I know is that teaching people about polarities who have an either or mindset, that actually teaching them how to make sense of polarities by doing a polarity navigator, by doing a polarity map, actually helps them, what Keegan would call, make an object, right? So that they have it, right? And it doesn't have them. And then they can do something with it. And I have found people who don't have who are earlier stage in the vertical development world can deal quite well with polarities if they have a sense-making tool. And then from the part that you were just alluding to, which is if I really see myself as a structure person, right? And now I'm given the chance to examine that and think about, well, wait a second. Yes, I'm structured, but would it be possible for me to expand, not lose, but to expand into being flexibly structured? What more might be at my disposal as a leader, right? I have so much more than choice or if I'm candidly diplomatic, right? If I can figure out that, right? Or if I can figure out a way to direct and empower people at the same time, right? And so I think what that does is it helps people from that vertical development perspective question how they make sense of themselves in the world and expand it. And I think polarities is a beautiful way to do that.
It's really interesting. I hadn't thought about polarity work as an identity expander, but it makes total sense. We're talking, for example, like we were discussing a gentleman who perhaps my identity is around control and direction. And then you're like, how could I be more? How could I expand? How could I take this control and direct and have it be even more effective and powerful? That's a great way to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm in the middle of that right now as my organization grows. At this point, we have an assessment that assesses 6 key polarities that leaders have to deal with, and how they can expand their identity around them. And one that I'm working on as the organization grows is direct and empower. And I have a big piece of my identity that has been created in earlier parts of my life as a leader as someone who empowers. Right. I was an empowering leader, right? And I realize now that I need to expand and be a leader who, my third way that I've named it is both voices and drums is the way that I've named that third way for myself.
What a cool name.
Yeah, that's my third way for, empower and direct. And I will, before I go into a meeting with an employee, I will ask myself, so how am I going to go into this as voices and drums? Right. And not just voices, right. Which is for me, the empower piece. Right. And so it's a way for me to really hold the blend and to expand my leadership capacity as a result. so that I don't, because I was definitely getting the overuses of empower on my team, right? I was really because that's what I wanted to be. I love the benefits of empower so much that I hold so tightly to that pole that I end up getting the overuses and creating the overuses on my team, And
so what are the overuses of empower? Because I'm sure a lot of people would like to know, empower sounds so good. What are the overuses?
Well, let's do it together. So if I overfocus on empower and I don't direct, then people oftentimes are left wondering where are we going? Where are we going? And what is it that Brian really wants here? We're in a startup situation. And so there's a lot of unknowns, right? A lot of chaos. And sometimes people want more of that stability and knowing. They want someone to actually say, this is what I think I should do. When I over-empower, there are some people, especially the people who like control, I'm seen as weak. I'm seen as a weak leader. Brian will never tell you, Brian doesn't tell you what to do, and Brian doesn't tell you what to think. And, as opposed to being a leader who shows up strong and saying, you know what, team, this is what I think we should do. And so lots of overuses to empower.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So if the other correlating map?
Yeah.
The leadership maturity framework that talks about the individualist stage of leadership maturity, which is you need and thinking to get there, which is all about embracing perspective and making sure everybody has their say at the table. And one of the shadow sides of that, or the overuse, is just what you explained, sitting too long in conversation and, being too politically correct or having to take a stand on anything. And it can be a quagmire and it can be very cloying instead of we've got to take some action and move on this thing now.
That's exactly it.
So thank you so much for sharing
That's exactly it.
Okay. I'm thinking about this other situation I've got with a different set of clients. And I'm curious about how you can reach for polarities, if there's a secret to it, or whether it's just more familiarity with the types of polarities that you see at play. So here's the situation. There's two silos, I guess, or two types of teams in the organization. And one team thinks that they work harder, or they don't think, they know. They work longer hours and they bring in less money than the other teams. The other team has very relaxed lifestyle. They don't have to work weekends, and their work in the business is more profitable. So this is creating tension. So you've got one team who says, we're the martyrs, and the other team says, well, we're the money makers. And it's coming to a head, a boiling point. How would we start to help? Because it's creating suffering. So there's tension. They're seeing it as personality conflicts, but it's not personality conflicts. It's this dynamic in the business. A couple of approaches we could take with this is looking at the systems at play in the organization. How is the workflows being set up, and is that causing the friction? My inkling is that maybe there's a polarity at play here. How would you go about diagnosing the best sense-making tool to use?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm trying to think of how to do this without asking you 1,000 questions. But I think are they when you say that they're martyrs, are they all compensated the same? Are they it sounds like
I think they are, but I don't know. I'd have to find that one out.
Yeah. I guess I think I'm thinking about why they would feel like martyrs. Right. And so to me, it means that to me seems to say that they feel like they're working really hard and they're not being compensated for it, or they work really hard and so the reward's really low. And so why do that? Right. And so I think, if that's the case, then it could be something like, if it's a reward structure, are we rewarding people just because of the amount of money that they bring in? Right. And so that's sort of performance, or it's conditional respect, or are we being respected just because we're people and the quality and the amount of work we do? Right. And so however it is that you named those poles, it sounds like maybe they are being rewarded, and not just maybe financially, but just being valued in the organization by how much money they bring into the organization, right? And that's the metric. But what's the other metric on the other side that also seems important, which sounds like it's unspoken for the people, that would be the amount of time and the effort that we're putting in,
Let me give another example because I can answer direct questions around this because it's my own personal experience. So when I worked at Outward Bound, which is personal development in the outdoors, there was two types of work in the organization, broadly based. There were those who went out in the field and did work in the outdoors with the students, and there were those who worked from an office-based situation. The office-based people had Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 jobs. The outdoorsy people didn't. It was 24 hours a day for 7 to 12 days at a time. And this created a similar paradigm. You know, it's almost like two camps looking across the fence saying, well, you guys, the admin staff would say, you guys get to have all these amazing adventures and go to these fabulous places and how awesome. And then the outdoorsy people would look at the office people and go, you guys get to have 9 to 5 and get paid more and it's more cushy. And, you know, we do all the, then the barter conversation starts to come up because they did get paid less. They work longer hours, but they almost become blind to the benefits of their own work. So it's similar in some ways to the corporate conversation that I just described. So your question so far, I mean, like, why do you feel like a martyr? Do you feel like you're working too hard, not getting paid enough? Yes, that was part of it, but they also lost sight of all the benefits that came with that kind of work. So that's where we sat. Do you think it's resolvable in terms of having two tribes within an organization that get paid differently and have very different work conditions?
Yeah. And do I think it's resolvable? I don't know if it's resolvable. I think it's manageable. I think that's one of the things is I think that in an organization like Outward Bound, that's always going to be a tension. Right. I mean, because you're always going to have people who are, you know, in the field, if we call it that, you know, and people who are in the office. And I think that's one of the things about polarities is that we know that they're not resolvable. They can only be managed over time. And that for many organizations and many leaders, that's an incredible aha. Carl Weick, who does a lot of writing about sense making in organizations, this isn't his exact quote, but it's something like, you know, managers spend an inordinate amount of time beating themselves up because they think they should be able to solve problems that actually aren't solvable. They can only be managed over time. And I think that's one of them, the one that you're using. That being said, I'm not sure if there's a polarity underneath of it. I think it just might be a problem. I definitely wouldn't set it up as field staff and office staff. They are interdependent, but I'm not really sure that they in and of themselves are a polarity. You know, and I wouldn't want to set the groups up. Now, I think that there's something in there around potentially rewarding the hands-on people and how we reward people who are behind the scenes. You know, maybe there's, you know, something about that. There is, and by reward, I don't mean just financial. I mean the valuing of everything. But it's a tough one because I think that to me is could be a much different issue than a polarity. So I'm not sure. Back to your original question, I'm not sure I would start with polarities in that case.
Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you. Maybe it's a problem, not a polarity, to be managed over time.
Yes.
And thinking back on my time there, and I think these things are circular in nature. So people come into the organization, let's say field staff, get super excited about doing the work, love it for a year or two, and then it loses its color as the realities of it, you know, being away, all the things that they give up to do it, become things that they want. And so you have to keep having the conversation about what's great about this work. You know, how do you define success? How do we do recognition? And do the same for the office staff. And maybe it's a bit of that.
Yeah. And so when you get into recognition, I mean, so there's something, you know, are we going to reward the individuals who are out front, right? Or are we going to reward the whole entire team, right? And so we need to do both of those. And I think that thinking about the reward system, and so many times something that looks like a problem will have many polarities underneath of it. Right. And so some of those polarities are worth paying attention to and some aren't worth paying attention to, you know. And so if I was going to be working with that organization, I would probably treat it as a presenting problem and then begin to look at what are the polarities that could potentially be underneath of it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, fantastic. You know. Now, this is going to consume a lot of my brain power for the next little while, thinking of how is this going to work? I mean, I've left Outward Bound 16 years ago, but there's plenty of organizations who have similar issues. You know, in construction, you have people on the ground, you have people in the office. You know, like,
yep,
all that. It's same dynamic or similar dynamic. Wow. Brian, where can people find out more about you and your work?
They can look. Our website is www.andiron.com. That's ANDIRON.com. And there's lots of information there about navigating polarities. We actually have an online course about navigating polarities that we've enrolled people in, to go more deeply into the subject. And also the key polarity indicator. KeyPolarityIndicator.com looks at the two assessments, one that looks at 6 human polarities that are important just to humanity, and one that looks at 6 key leadership polarities and looks at how well people are navigating those.
Fantastic. I'm going to go check those out. That's terrific. Brian, thank you so much. That was just so fabulous to talk through some of these things that have been niggling away at me for ages, and to explain this fabulous approach to understanding some of the more complex things that we have to deal with as leaders and as humans. I've really so much enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. It's great. It's always fun to find someone who likes to talk about it. So thank you.
Well, hey, there was lots of cool stuff in that interview, right? A couple things I'm taking away is the idea of blending colors and how you can reach for it and thinking, where you can have the best of both worlds, the blue and the red that creates the purple. I love that as a metaphor for what this kind of work is really about. And the other one is thinking about polarities and not pros and cons, but overuses. And I think that's a really useful lens to help people inch their way towards becoming more au fait with and thinking. Because we think about overuses, it doesn't make us wrong. And I think that's a really important piece when we start to do this work. It applies really, really well when I teach things like DISC, which is about behavior preferences. And quite often people will feel like their preference is made to be wrong, and that's not the case at all. It all has an overuse. Each preference has an overuse, and I think balancing it is the gem in this one for me. And I'm definitely going to look up keypolarity.com and looking at those polarities in leadership and life and the world. Right. Okay. So I'd love for you to do a couple of things if you're into it. If you love this episode, of course, please share it with others on social media. It's how we grow our audience. It's how we get this really useful leadership frameworks out into the world to help people lead and live better. So definitely do that if you like the show and like this episode. And also, we've got a report on our website now, a free resource for you. It's called How to Spot and Deal with Difficult Behavior. And it's if you go to my website, zoerouth.com, and click on resources, you'll get access to that free report. And you'll get our monthly updates. I write an in-depth leadership article once a month. And that way you can stay in touch with a deeper dive around some of these really interesting and useful leadership sense-making maps, as an example, or concepts. And it's also where you get all my latest news and updates, and you'll be the first to know when my latest novel comes out. All right, and I'd love to hear from you. So you can email me at zoe@zoerouth.com. Go to our Facebook page, which is always linked into the show notes. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm there quite a lot. Occasionally on Twitter and Instagram. And my Twitter handle is zoerouth.com. All right, in the meantime, you know what? Live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.